Silver struck crystal with a sharp, piercing ring, a heavy spoon serving as a drunkard's gavel. That single sound cut through the suffocating haze of cigar smoke and spilled brandy. It was a joke, of course. Everything in her family was a joke, especially her. "Do I hear 5 shillings for the quiet one?" her father slurred. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. Clara stared at the floorboards, waiting for the humiliation to pass. Then, a voice from the shadow of the room, quiet and cold enough to freeze hell itself, spoke. £10,000. Clara Stanton was a woman built of ledgers and lint. At 24, she had long ago passed the invisible threshold where society stopped viewing a woman as a prospect and began treating her as furniture. She did not mind. Furniture, after all, was rarely asked to converse with idiots. The Stanton family carriage smelled of damp wool and her stepmother's cheap lavender water. It rattled over the rutted roads toward Montague Hall, entirely lacking the suspension required to make the journey bearable. Clara sat with her back to the horses, the designated seat for the least important person in the box. Across from her, her father, Lord George Stanton, snored softly, his chin resting on a stained cravat. Next to him sat Lady Caroline, clutching a parasol like a weapon, and Clara's 2 half-sisters, Arabella and Jane. Arabella and Jane were the investments. They were swathed in pink and yellow silks, paid for by a butcher who was currently threatening to take Lord Stanton to debtor's prison. Clara, meanwhile, wore a dark grey broadcloth dress that had seen 3 winters and would likely see a 4th. "Do try not to look so hopelessly dismal, Clara," Lady Caroline snapped, her eyes narrowing as she adjusted Arabella's bonnet. "Lord Montague's house party is the event of the season. If you stand in the corners looking like a widowed crow, you will ruin Arabella's chances." "I shall endeavour to blend into the wallpaper, ma'am," Clara replied, her voice flat. She wasn't weeping internally. Clara had run out of tears at 16 when she realized her father's gambling debts had swallowed her mother's dowry, leaving Clara entirely dependent on a man who considered a deck of cards a better companion than his own child. Clara's days were spent dodging creditors at the back door of their crumbling London townhouse. Her nights were spent altering Arabella's dresses so the girl could parade before dukes and earls. Society was a meat market. Clara had simply accepted that she was the unmarbled cut left on the block. The carriage lurched through the massive iron gates of Montague Hall. The estate was a sprawling monument to excess, built of pale stone and surrounded by manicured lawns that required the labor of 50 men to maintain. Lord Montague was notorious. He was wealthy, unwed, and possessed a moral compass that pointed firmly toward whatever amused him in the moment. His house parties were less about polite conversation and more about seeing how far the aristocracy could degrade themselves before Monday morning. "Remember," Lord Stanton muttered, waking up and wiping a line of drool from his chin. "Smile. Be agreeable. Montague has a fondness for the races. If he asks Jane, you love horses." "I despise horses, Papa," Jane whined. "They smell." "Then lie," he snapped, the jovial mask slipping to reveal the panicked debtor beneath. They disembarked into the chaotic energy of the entry hall. Servants rushed past with trays of champagne. Women laughed a little too loudly. Men leaned a little too close. Clara fell to the back of the family formation. She collected her sister's cloaks, handed them to a passing footman, and assumed her position. The invisible chaperone, the ugly sister, the wallflower. For 2 days, she perfected the art of non-existence. She stood near the potted palms in the ballroom while Arabella danced. She fetched lemonade. She carried Lady Caroline's smelling salts. She watched the frantic, desperate mating dance of the upper class with a cynical eye. She watched young women trade their bodies and futures for titles, and old men trade their fortunes for youth. It was a miserable, glittering transaction, and she watched Alexander. The Duke of Hawkesbury was not a man one simply glanced at. He occupied space like a monolith. He was 30, tall, and possessed a face that was strikingly aristocratic, but entirely devoid of warmth. A localized fire at his country estate 3 years prior had left a faint, jagged burn scar creeping up from his left collarbone to the edge of his jaw. It gave him a dangerous, asymmetrical look. He did not dance. He rarely spoke. He stood in the shadows of the drawing rooms, nursing a single glass of scotch, watching the revelry with eyes the color of winter ice. Clara had caught him looking at her twice, not with lust nor with pity. He looked at her the way a man inspecting the structural integrity of a building might look, searching for the cracks. Clara had held his gaze. She had nothing to lose by looking back. She was entirely beneath his notice, a grey moth in a room full of peacocks, or so she thought. It was the third night of the party, and the veneer of civilization had entirely peeled away. The women had ostensibly retired to the drawing rooms, but the braver, or more desperate, among them had drifted into the billiard room, where the men were drinking heavily and playing for high stakes. Arabella wanted an audience. She had cornered a young viscount near the fireplace and insisted Clara stand 3 feet away to provide the illusion of propriety. The room was stifling. It smelled of stale sweat, expensive tobacco, and spilled gin. The air was thick, difficult to pull into the lungs. At the center of the room sat the main faro table. Lord Montague was dealing. Lord Stanton was betting. Clara watched her father's hands. They were shaking. He pushed a small stack of notes into the center of the table. Montague flipped a card. Stanton lost. He pushed forward a signet ring. Montague flipped. Stanton lost. "That appears to be the end of your tether, George," Montague drawled, leaning back in his chair. He was a bloated man, his face flushed with wine. "Unless you have a deed to a property I don't know about." "Just one more hand, Montague," Stanton begged, his voice high and thin. "I can secure funds by the end of the month, on my honor." Laughter rippled around the table. Lord Stanton's honor was worth less than the dust on the floorboards. "I don't play for promises," Montague said. He looked around the room, his eyes glittering with drunken malice. "But I am a sporting man. What else do you have? You have daughters, don't you?" The room went dangerously quiet. Arabella gasped, clutching the Viscount's arm. "Now, Montague, be reasonable," Lord Stanton sputtered, sweating profusely. "I am entirely reasonable," Montague shouted, slamming a fist on the table. "You owe me £3,000, George. I want collateral. We'll have an auction. A bit of sport." He grabbed a heavy silver spoon and struck the side of a crystal brandy decanter. Clink. "Step right up, gentlemen. What am I bid for the Stanton girls?" "You can't be serious," Lady Caroline hissed, suddenly appearing in the doorway. But she didn't leave. She didn't drag her husband from the room. She was paralyzed by the social ruin unfolding before her. "I won't bid on the blonde," slurred a baron from the corner. "Too much upkeep." Arabella began to cry. The men laughed. It was a blood sport, and they had found the scent. Lady Caroline stepped forward, her face pale, desperate to turn the humiliation into a jest, to save Arabella from the brunt of the mockery. "If you must have a joke, Montague, take Clara. She's sturdy, doesn't eat much, and she's exceptionally quiet." Clara stopped breathing. The room turned to look at her. She stood by the fireplace in her drab grey dress. She felt the heat of the fire on her back and the sudden chilling weight of 30 pairs of eyes on her front. "Ah, the quiet one!" Montague bellowed, delighted by Lady Caroline's monstrous betrayal. "Brilliant! Come here, girl. Up on the footstool." Clara looked at her father. Lord Stanton wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the green baize of the card table. He was going to let this happen. If it bought him time, if it smoothed over the awkwardness of his ruin, he would let them make a spectacle of her. "Go on, Clara," Lady Caroline whispered fiercely, shoving her shoulder. "Play along. Don't ruin your father." Clara moved. She didn't feel her legs beneath her. She felt entirely detached from her own body, floating somewhere near the ceiling, watching a grey moth walk toward the center of the room. She stepped onto the low velvet footstool next to the faro table. She did not cry. She locked her jaw. She found a crack in the plaster molding near the ceiling and stared at it with ferocious intensity. "You will not break me," she thought. "You are nothing. This is nothing." "Right then," Montague cried, striking the decanter again. "What am I bid for the quiet one? She's a bit long in the tooth, gentlemen, but she has a pulse. Do I hear 5 shillings? "I bid a rusted horseshoe," shouted a young buck near the window. "A half-empty bottle of gin," called another. 2 pennies and a button. The laughter was deafening. It bounced off the wood-paneled walls, a physical force that battered against Clara's ears. Her cheeks burned. Her hands, resting at her sides, curled into fists so tight her fingernails broke the skin of her palms. It was the purest distillation of her life. She was a joke. She was collateral. She was nothing. "Do I hear 5 shillings for the spinster?" Her father suddenly slurred, trying to join in the joke, trying to show he was part of the boys' club and not the pathetic wretch he truly was. The cruelty of her father's voice was the final strike. A single hot tear broke free and slid down Clara's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She stood completely still, and then the laughter stopped. It didn't stop gradually. It was severed, the suffocating hush of predators realizing a bigger predator had entered. The cage fell over the billiard room. Clara didn't move her head, but from the corner of her eye, she saw the shadow detach itself from the wall. Alexander, Duke of Hawkesbury, stepped into the light of the chandelier. He held his glass of Soch loosely in his right hand. He wore no jacket, only a dark waistcoat and a stark white shirt, his cravat untied. The jagged scar on his neck seemed starker under the gaslight. He did not look at Montague. He did not look at Lord Stanton. He looked only at Clara. Standing on the velvet footstool, a single tear drying on her face. He had watched her for 3 days. He had watched her mend her sister's hem in the dim light of the hallway. He had watched her calculate the price of a spilled bottle of wine by the grimace on her face. Hawkesbury knew the exact stench of desperate people. He had grown up surrounded by sycophants who would sell their own mothers for a nod of his head. He found society utterly, profoundly repulsive. But this woman, she was different. She had stood on that stool, offered up to the wolves by her own blood, and she had not shattered. She had turned to iron. Hawkesbury walked slowly toward the center of the room. The men parted for him like water. No one breathed. The clinking of glasses ceased. He stopped directly in front of the faro table. He set his Scotch down on the green felt. The soft thud sounded like a cannon shot in the silence. £10,000, he said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, gravelly baritone that required no volume to command absolute authority. Lord Montague blinked, his drunken brain struggling to process the words. I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "I said," Hawkesbury repeated, his eyes finally shifting to Montague, pinning the man in place. £10,000. Someone in the back of the room let out a choked breath. £10,000 was an astronomical sum. It was an estate. It was a fortune. It was a bid so utterly absurd, so removed from the realm of the cruel joke they were playing, that the reality of the room seemed to fracture. Lord Stanton scrambled out of his chair, nearly knocking it over. "Your Grace, surely this is a jest. The girl is barely worth the clothes. She—" "Silence," Hawkesbury didn't raise his voice, but Stanton snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth clicked. The Duke reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat. He withdrew a heavy, folded piece of parchment, a bank draft. He tossed it onto the table. It landed on top of Stanton's pathetic pile of shillings. "That draft is drawn on the Bank of England," Hawkesbury said, his voice terrifyingly conversational. "It clears Lord Stanton's debts to you, Montague. The remainder belongs to Stanton." He looked back at Clara's father. "On the condition that you never speak to, look at, or acknowledge the existence of this woman again. She is no longer your daughter. She is my property." Lady Caroline swayed on her feet. Arabella let out a pathetic squeak. Clara stared down at the Duke. Her heart was beating so violently she thought her ribs might crack. He was mad. He had to be mad. This was a different kind of joke, a crueler one, playing out on a scale she couldn't comprehend. "My Lord Duke," Clara said. Her voice was raspy, unused but entirely steady. "I am not for sale." Hawkesbury looked up at her. For a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, it was an acknowledgement. "Everyone in this room is for sale, Miss Stanton," he said softly. "Just for her. I am merely the only one offering a fair price." He stepped up to the footstool. He didn't offer his hand to assist her down like a gentleman at a ball. He simply stood there, an immovable force, waiting. "You can stay on the stool," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You can step down and walk back to a man who just priced you at 5 shillings, or you can walk out that door with me." It wasn't a fairy tale rescue. It was a blunt, cynical transaction. He was buying her. But as Clara looked into his cold, winter ice eyes, she saw no cruelty. She saw a mirror of her own absolute exhaustion with the world. Clara looked at her father, who was already reaching a trembling hand toward the bank draft. She looked at her stepmother, whose eyes were wide with a sickening mixture of shock and greed. Clara lifted her chin. She gathered the heavy wool of her frayed grey skirt in one hand. She stepped down from the footstool. She did not take the Duke's arm. She didn't need to. She simply walked past him, her spine straight, heading directly for the heavy oak doors of the billiard room. Hawkesbury picked up his glass of scotch, downed it in a single swallow, and followed her out into the dark hallway, leaving the ruins of the Stanton family behind. The night air outside Montague Hall was sharp enough to slice skin. Clara inhaled, filling her lungs with the metallic bite of frost, letting it clear the stench of gin and stale sweat from her senses. She did not look back at the sprawling stone mansion. She did not look back at the lighted windows, where her family was likely already dividing the Duke's fortune in their minds. Hawkesbury's carriage waited at the base of the sweeping marble steps. It was not a gilded parade vehicle designed to advertise wealth. It was solid black, devoid of family crests, heavily sprung, and pulled by 4 massive Hanoverian bays. A single footman stood by the door. He did not blink at the sight of his master emerging with a woman in a frayed grey dress and no luggage. He simply pulled the door open, lowered the step, and stared straight ahead. Clara climbed inside. The interior smelled of expensive leather, clean wool, and a faint trace of sandalwood. She took the forward-facing seat out of habit, tucking herself into the corner. Hawkesbury climbed in after her. He took the opposite bench. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing them in a dim, swaying box of silence. The carriage lurched forward, leaving the gravel drive and hitting the main road with a smooth, rhythmic cadence that mocked the chaotic rattling she had endured 2 days prior. They drove for an hour in absolute silence. Clara stared at the passing shadows of trees through the glass. Her mind was a suspended mechanism, the gears frozen in shock. She had been sold. It was an illegal, entirely non-binding transaction under the law, of course. A human being could not be auctioned over a faro table in 19th century England, but the law was a fiction written for the poor. In the world of dukes and earldoms, money was the only law. £10,000 had purchased her father's silence and her absolute isolation. She was ruined. If she demanded to be let out at the next village, she would be a penniless spinster with a destroyed reputation, left to starve in a ditch. She had nowhere else to go. "You are waiting for me to explain myself," Hawkesbury said. His voice startled her, low and resonant over the steady drumming of the hooves. The carriage interior was too dark to read his expression, but she could see the glint of the carriage lamps reflecting off his pale eyes. "I am waiting to arrive at wherever it is we are going," Clara replied, keeping her voice entirely level. "Explanations usually follow the destination, or so I assume. I have never been purchased before." A heavy pause settled between them. "We are going to Brambling," he said. "My primary estate in Yorkshire. We will arrive by tomorrow evening. We change horses at dawn." "Am I to be your mistress, then?" Clara asked. She didn't whisper it. She didn't blush. The time for maidenly propriety had died on that velvet footstool. She needed the parameters of her disaster. God, no. The answer was immediate, devoid of any insulting hesitation, simply a statement of hard fact. "I have no need for a mistress, Miss Stanton. And if I did, I would not acquire one through a drunken spectacle orchestrated by a degenerate." "Then why?" she demanded. The first crack of genuine emotion splintered her voice. "Why pay £10,000? You could have bought half of London for that." Hawkesbury shifted, leaning back against the leather squabs. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I did not buy half of London. I bought a solution. I will explain the precise terms of that solution tomorrow, when you are not operating on adrenaline and shock. For now, you will sleep. There is a heavy wool blanket under your seat. Use it." He closed his eyes, signaling the end of the conversation. Clara stared at him for a long time. The jagged scar on his neck was barely visible in the gloom. He was a terrifying man. He possessed the kind of power that did not need to shout to be heard. Yet, as she reached under the seat and pulled out a thick, impossibly soft cashmere blanket, she realized something strange. She was not afraid of him. She was terrified of her situation, but not of the man himself. She wrapped the blanket around her shivering shoulders. She pressed her head against the glass. Against all logic, listening to the steady breathing of the Duke of Hawkesbury, Clara slept. They arrived at Brambling Estate as the sun dipped below the Yorkshire moors, casting long, bruised shadows across the landscape. If Montague Hall was a monument to excess, Brambling was a fortress of absolute, unyielding permanence. It was built of dark grey stone, lacking any delicate ornamentation. It sat against the rugged hills like an extension of the earth itself. The carriage pulled into a massive courtyard. Before it fully stopped, the heavy oak front doors swung open. Servants lined the stone steps in perfect, rigid order. Clara stepped down, her grey dress looking even more pathetic against the backdrop of such imposing wealth. Her muscles ached. Her mouth was dry. Hawkesbury joined her. He did not offer his arm. He looked at the line of staff. "Mrs. Gable," he said, addressing a severe-looking woman in black silk standing at the head of the line. "This is Miss Stanton. She is exhausted. Put her in the east wing, draw a bath, burn her dress, and find her something suitable from the old trunks until a modiste can be summoned from York. She is to be treated with the exact deference you show me." Mrs. Gable's eyes flicked to Clara for a fraction of a second, registering the fraying hem, the utter lack of luggage, and the hollow exhaustion in Clara's face. Her expression remained completely blank. "At once, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, executing a flawless curtsy. Hawkesbury turned to Clara. Eat, sleep. My study is the last door on the left in the main corridor. Be there at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." He walked away, disappearing into the cavernous depths of the house. Clara was left standing in the courtyard, a newly acquired asset waiting to be processed. The East Wing suite was larger than the entire ground floor of her father's London townhouse. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and roasting bread. For a panicked moment, she did not know where she was. The mattress was too soft, the linens too heavy, the silence too complete. There was no sound of dunning creditors banging on the front door, no shrill whining from Arabella. Then the memory of the billiard room crashed into her, heavy and suffocating. She sat up. On the velvet armchair near the blazing hearth sat a dress. It was not her grey wool. It was a dark, forest green morning gown of heavy twill. It was outdated by perhaps 10 years, but the fabric was rich and pristine. Her grey dress was gone, burned as he had ordered. Clara washed, dressed herself. The gown was slightly too large in the bodice, but manageable, and braided her hair into a tight, severe crown. She stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The girl in the glass was pale, with dark smudges under her eyes, but her jaw was set. At exactly 5 minutes to 10, she knocked on the heavy oak door at the end of the main corridor. "Enter." Hawkesbury's study was a massive working room. It smelled of ink, old paper, and black coffee. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books and ledgers. There were no decorative portraits, no useless porcelain figurines. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Hawkesbury sat behind it, surrounded by neat stacks of correspondence. He wore a dark jacket, his cravat tied loosely. He looked up as she entered. He didn't stand. He gestured to a leather chair opposite him. "Sit." Clara sat. She folded her hands in her lap, keeping her spine rigid. "Did you sleep?" he asked, dipping a steel-nibbed pen into a brass inkwell. "I did, Your Grace." "Good." He set the pen down and leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked at her with that same architectural scrutiny he had used at the house party. "Let us dispense with pleasantries. You want to know your purpose here." "I would appreciate knowing what £10,000 purchases," Clara said evenly. "It purchases a duchess." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Clara stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she frowned. "I beg your pardon? I require a wife," Hawkesbury stated, as if discussing the need to purchase a new carriage horse. "I'm 30 years old. The dukedom requires an heir, eventually. But more immediately, it requires management. I loathe society, Miss Stanton. I loathe the simpering mothers, the desperate daughters, the endless, rotting cycle of balls and dinners. I loathe the sycophants who line up at my door demanding patronage. I need a woman to stand as a wall between me and the rest of the world. A woman to manage my estates, handle my social obligations with brutal efficiency, and ensure I am left in absolute peace. There are hundreds of titled women bred for exactly that purpose," Clara pointed out, her mind struggling to keep pace with his blunt pragmatism. "Women with dowries, women who are not the spinster daughters of ruined gamblers. Titled women bred for this purpose expect romance," Hawkesbury countered, his lip curling slightly. "They expect affection, or at least the pantomime of it. They expect to host parties and be admired. They want poetry. I have no poetry to give." He gestured toward his scarred neck. "And I have no patience for women who flinch when they look at me." Clara looked at the scar. It was brutal, puckered and white against his skin. She did not flinch. She just saw skin. "I watched you at Montague Hall," Hawkesbury continued, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, intense edge. "I watched you operate. You managed your ruined father. You managed your vapid sisters. You anticipated problems before they occurred. You possess a completely unsentimental view of the world. You do not cry over spilled milk. You simply calculate the cost of replacing the jug. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. You stood on that block, humiliated before 50 men, sold by your own father, and you didn't break. You turned to iron. I need iron, Miss Stanton. I do not need a flower. I need a shield. Clara stared at his hands. Broad, strong hands. The reality of his proposition was stark. It was entirely devoid of warmth, but it was honest. It was the first honest transaction she had ever been offered. You are offering a business arrangement, she said quietly. I am offering a contract, he corrected. We will marry by special license before the end of the week. You will have full authority over the domestic staff and social calendar of all my properties. You will have a generous allowance, entirely your own, to do with as you please. You will never see your father or your family again. You will protect my time, manage my household, and in return, you will have wealth, security, and the absolute highest rank a woman can hold in this country. Clara processed the terms. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to survive in the margins of her family's disasters. Now this terrifying, scarred man was offering her the keys to an empire, simply because he recognized her capacity to endure. And the matter of an heir? She asked, forcing the words out, ignoring the sudden heat in her cheeks. We will do what is necessary to secure the line, he said, his voice clinically detached. Nothing more. I will not force myself upon you. We will approach it as we approach any other duty, with efficiency. It was monstrously cold, it was deeply cynical, and it was exactly what she wanted to hear. No lies, no pretending. Clara unclasped her hands. She met his gaze directly. My father's debts were vast, she said, her voice steady. But he was not a complete fool. He taught me how to read a ledger. He taught me how to spot a cheat. If I am to run your houses, I run the estate accounts as well. I want access to the books. Hawkesbury's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his stoic features. The estate managers handle the ledgers, he said. Then I will manage the estate managers, Clara replied. If I'm to be your shield, Your Grace, I need to know the structural integrity of the walls. I will not be a blind figurehead. If you want a partner in this cold war you have declared against society, I require full ammunition. Hawkesbury stared at her. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of her demand. The Duke of Hawkesbury did not answer to anyone, let alone a woman he had purchased 48 hours ago. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was that same small, microscopic movement she had seen in the billiard room. He opened a drawer in his desk, pulled out a massive ring of iron keys, and slid them across the polished mahogany. They stopped inches from her hand. The master ledgers are in the safe behind you, Hawkesbury said. Welcome to Brambling, Clara. They were married 4 days later, in a damp, unheated parish church on the edge of the village. The vicar, a nervous man with a perpetually running nose, stumbled over the vows, intimidated by the Duke's stony presence. Clara wore the green twill dress, Hawkesbury wore black. There were no flowers, no music, no congratulations. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Hawkesbury simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out to the waiting carriage. Clara signed the register. Clara Stanton became Clara, Duchess of Hawkesbury, a signature that erased a lifetime of irrelevance. She did not wait for a honeymoon. The moment they returned to Brambling, Clara took her ring of keys and walked into the estate office. The office was a dusty, chaotic room in the West Wing, ruled by Mr. Thomas Griffith. Griffith was a man in his late 50s who possessed the arrogant complacency of a servant who had gone unmonitored for a decade. He viewed the Duke's sudden marriage to a nameless nobody with open contempt, a sentiment he barely bothered to conceal when Clara demanded the books. For 3 weeks, Clara did not see her husband. Hawkesbury retreated to his study or rode out onto the moors, leaving her entirely to her own devices. Clara spent those weeks buried in ink and parchment. She worked with a ruthless, methodical focus. She cross-referenced the grain yields against the market receipts. She matched the timber sales against the replanting invoices. She sat at a small desk in the corner of the estate office, ignoring Griffith's loud sighs and passive-aggressive complaints about women meddling in men's arithmetic. By the 3rd week, her fingers were permanently stained black. She had found it. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the window was grey and threatening rain. Clara closed the ledger for 1812, stacked it neatly on top of the 1813 volume, and stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her practical dark wool dress. She had ordered 3 made, simple, austere, and functional, and walked to the centre of the office. "Mr. Griffith," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the scratch of his pen. The estate manager looked up, his expression thoroughly bored. "Yes, Your Grace? Have you found a column that doesn't sum to your liking? Perhaps the cook can explain it to you." "I have found a discrepancy," Clara said, ignoring his tone, a rather significant one regarding the sale of the northern timber tract last autumn. Griffith stiffened slightly. "The timber market fluctuates, Your Grace. It is complex." "Addition is not complex, Mr. Griffith. You recorded the sale of 4,000 cords of oak. The receipt from the York lumber yard confirms they purchased 6,000. There is a difference of roughly £2,000. Clara leaned slightly over his desk, resting her knuckles on the wood. £2,000 that somehow bypassed the Duke's main account and was routed into a holding firm in Leeds. A firm registered to a T. Griffith. The blood drained from the man's face. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "How dare you? You come into this house, a purchased harlot from a ruined family, and accuse me of theft. The Duke trusts me. He has trusted me for 10 years. "The Duke did not care enough to check your math," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I care. You are a thief, and worse, you are a sloppy one." "I will speak to His Grace immediately," Griffith shouted, his face now purple with rage and panic. "He will not stand for this. He will toss you back into the gutter where he found you." "You don't have to go far, Griffith," the voice came from the doorway. Clara didn't jump, but Griffith let out a strangled gasp. Hawkesbury leaned against the doorframe. He wore his riding boots, flecked with mud, holding a riding crop loosely in his right hand. His eyes were fixed on the estate manager, and they were utterly devoid of mercy. He had been standing there for minutes. "Your Grace!" Griffith sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. "The Duchess is—" "She doesn't understand the complexities of the estate. She is making wild accusations." Hawkesbury slowly pushed himself off the doorframe and walked into the room. He didn't look at the ledgers. He didn't look at Griffith. He walked directly to Clara and stopped beside her. "Did you find £2,000, Clara?" he asked, his voice conversational. "I found 3,400 over the course of 3 years, Clara corrected, looking up at him. "The timber was just the most recent." Hawkesbury finally turned his head to look at Griffith. The manager recoiled as if struck. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave my property," Hawkesbury said softly. "If you are found within the borders of Brambling at sundown, I will have you arrested for embezzlement, and you will hang at York Castle. Do not test me." Griffith opened his mouth, closed it, and scrambled past them, fleeing the office as if the devil himself were giving chase. The room descended into silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Clara looked back at the desk, suddenly feeling the adrenaline drain from her limbs. She pressed a hand to her stomach, willing the slight tremor in her fingers to stop. "You knew," Clara said softly, staring at the empty chair. "You knew he was stealing from you." "I suspected," Hawkesbury admitted. He moved to the desk and picked up the ledger she had closed. He flipped it open, scanning her neat, precise annotations in the margins. "I didn't care to spend the time proving it. The estate generates $50,000 a year. Losing 3 was a tax on my peace of mind to avoid dealing with the man." "It is a matter of principle," Clara snapped, suddenly furious at his indifference. "It is disorder. It is a rot in the foundation." Hawkesbury looked up from the book. He studied her face, the smudge of ink on her cheek, the fierce, uncompromising set of her jaw, the genuine outrage in her eyes over stolen money that wasn't even hers. He reached out. Clara froze as his hand approached her face. But he didn't strike her. His thumb, rough with calluses, gently wiped the smudge of black ink from her cheekbone. The touch was startlingly intimate, a spark of heat in the cold room. "You are exactly what I paid for," Hawkesbury murmured, a dark, profound satisfaction in his voice. "Iron." He dropped his hand and turned toward the door. "Burn his holding firm to the ground, Clara. Take back every penny. When you are finished, come to the library. We will have a drink." He walked out, leaving the door open. Clara stood in the quiet office, touching her cheek where the ghost of his thumb still burned. She looked at the ledgers. She was not a joke anymore. She was the architect of a fortress, and she was going to make its walls impenetrable. Autumn bled into a harsh, unforgiving winter, and Clara built her empire. She did not do it with smiles, and she did not do it with threats. She did it with a relentless, terrifying competence. Within 2 months, the domestic staff of Brambling moved with the precision of a military regiment. The massive kitchens, previously a chaotic drain on the estate's funds, were reorganized. The wine cellars were inventoried. The local merchants, who had long overcharged the Duke's absentee household, were summoned one by one to Clara's office. They walked in expecting a naive young bride. They walked out sweating, having agreed to market rates, holding contracts signed in Clara's sharp, unforgiving hand. She and Alexander settled into a strange, frictionless orbit. They did not share a bed. They rarely shared meals. But every evening at 8 o'clock, Clara would walk into the library. Alexander would pour 2 glasses of scotch. He would sit behind his desk, and she would sit in the leather wingback chair by the fire. They would spend an hour in silence. Sometimes she brought a ledger. Sometimes she brought a book. He read his correspondence. It was not romantic. It was a shared bunker. It was the deepest peace Clara had ever known. Then, in late November, the outside world breached the walls. Clara was in the morning room, reviewing the winter fuel consumption, when Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway. The housekeeper's face was uncharacteristically tight. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, "the Dowager Countess of Westmoreland's carriage has just pulled into the courtyard. She is demanding an audience." Clara did not look up from her numbers. "I am not receiving callers, Mrs. Gable. I informed her of that, Your Grace. She bypassed me, pushed past the footman, and is currently seating herself in the primary drawing room. She claims she is an old, dear friend of the Duke's mother, and will not be turned away by staff." Clara slowly set her pen down. The ink dried instantly in the cold air of the room. Lady Westmoreland was a notorious social predator. She was the matriarch of the very society Alexander loathed, a woman who traded in scandal and ruin. She had not come to Brambling to offer congratulations. She had come to inspect the damage. She wanted to see the purchased bride. She wanted blood. "Tell the kitchen we will not be requiring tea," Clara said, standing up and smoothing the skirt of her heavy charcoal dress. "I will handle the Countess." Clara walked down the long, drafty corridors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the runner carpets. When she pushed open the doors to the drawing room, Lady Westmoreland was standing by the fireplace, running a critical, white-gloved finger over the mantelpiece. She was a woman in her late 50s, wrapped in expensive Russian sable, with a face that resembled a starved hawk. "Ah," Lady Westmoreland said, turning slowly. Her eyes swept over Clara's plain dress, her unadorned hair, her lack of jewelry. A smile, thin and cruel, touched the older woman's lips. "You must be the acquisition." "I am the Duchess of Hawkesbury," Clara replied, stopping in the center of the room. She didn't offer a curtsy. She did not invite the woman to sit. "Of course you are, my dear," Lady Westmoreland purred, taking a step forward. "London is entirely ablaze with the news. We were all so terribly shocked. Alexander has always been eccentric, particularly since his accident. But buying a wife from George Stanton's gambling pile? It borders on madness. We assumed he had taken you as a scullery maid until the registry was checked." Clara felt the old, familiar weight of humiliation trying to settle on her shoulders. It was the same tone her stepmother used, the same tone Montague had used before striking the decanter. For a fraction of a second, she was back on the velvet footstool. But she was no longer Clara Stanton. She was iron. "It is a 4-day journey from London to Yorkshire in November, Lady Westmoreland," Clara said, her voice dropping into a register that was eerily similar to her husband's. Flat, cold, factual. "The roads are deeply unpleasant. To travel such a distance merely to satisfy your own vulgar curiosity suggests a profound emptiness in your own life." Lady Westmoreland blinked, her jaw slackening. Nobody spoke to her like that. "I beg your pardon? You are trespassing," Clara continued, stepping closer. "My husband despises you and the rotting social carcass you represent. I was brought here specifically to ensure he never has to look at people like you again. You will not have tea. You will not have a rest. You will return to your carriage immediately." "You insolent little nobody," Lady Westmoreland hissed, her aristocratic mask cracking to reveal pure venom. "You think a ring and a piece of paper makes you my equal? You are a joke. You are a parlor trick Alexander played to insult the ton. When he tires of you, you will be nothing. When he tires of me, I will still be the Duchess of Hawkesbury," Clara said softly. And you will still be standing in my house, uninvited. Get out." "I demand to speak to Alexander," the Countess shrieked. "He is entirely unavailable." "Is he?" The deep, gravelly voice came from the shadows near the library doors. Clara didn't turn. She knew the sound of those boots. Alexander stepped into the light. He wore a dark riding coat, smelling faintly of frost and leather. He looked at Lady Westmoreland with an expression of such profound disgust that the older woman actually took a step back toward the fireplace. "Alexander," Lady Westmoreland stammered, attempting to recover her composure. "I was just attempting to welcome your new bride. She seems to lack the basic refinements of hospitality." "My wife," Alexander said, walking to stand directly beside Clara, "is the supreme authority of this estate. If she tells you to leave, Agatha, you leave. If you ever speak to her in that tone again, I will personally buy the mortgages on your son's London properties and evict him into the street. Do you understand me?" The silence in the drawing room was absolute. Lady Westmoreland's face flushed a mottled, ugly red. She looked from Alexander's scarred, unyielding face to Clara's calm, merciless eyes. She realized, with a sudden, sinking horror that she was not looking at a mismatched joke. She was looking at a fortress. The Countess gathered her sable coat, her hands trembling slightly, and swept out of the room without another word. The heavy front doors slammed shut a moment later. Alexander stood beside Clara for a long time, listening to the crunch of the carriage wheels retreating down the gravel drive. "You did not have to intervene," Clara said quietly. "I had the matter handled." "I know," Alexander replied. He looked down at her. The winter light caught the sharp angles of his face. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a dark, burning intensity. "But you are my wife. You fight my wars, Clara. I will execute anyone who tries to shoot you in the back." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the back of her hand. It was a fleeting, almost accidental touch, but in the freezing drawing room it felt like a brand. 8 o'clock in the library, he said, turning away. Clara watched him go. Her heart was beating entirely too fast. The contract was shifting. The ink was bleeding. By January, the snow was 6 feet deep in the drifts against the eastern walls. Brambling was cut off from the world, a stone island in a sea of white. The isolation acted as a pressure cooker. The quiet, frictionless orbit Clara and Alexander had established began to decay. The air in the library during their 8 o'clock ritual grew thick, heavy, with things left entirely unspoken. Clara found herself watching the line of his throat when he swallowed his scotch. Alexander found himself tracking the movement of her hands as she turned the pages of her books. The efficiency of their arrangement was failing. They were hyper-aware of one another. The massive, echoing house felt suddenly, claustrophobically small. It happened on a Tuesday. The wind was screaming around the stone turrets, rattling the heavy glass panes of the library windows. The fire was a roaring beast in the hearth, throwing erratic, leaping shadows across the room. Clara closed her book. The sound was unnaturally loud. She did not look at him. She stared at the flames. "We are in breach of contract," she said. Alexander froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly, the amber liquid catching the firelight. "Explain. The terms of my employment," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, were gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. "You require an heir. You stated we would do what is necessary to secure the line. I have been here for 3 months. We have not secured anything." The silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. "I told you I would not force myself upon you," Alexander said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous gravel. "I will not treat you like a mare brought to stud to fulfill a ledger requirement." "It is a ledger requirement," Clara countered, finally turning her head to look at him. Her chest rose and fell in a sharp, ragged breath. "I am entirely practical, Alexander. I do not expect poetry. I expect to do my duty." He stared at her. His jaw clenched, the muscle ticking near the edge of his scar. He set his glass down on the desk. He stood up. He was a massive man, and in the dim light of the library, he looked terrifying. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her chair. "You think this is practical?" he asked, his voice harsh. "You think you can turn this into a mathematical equation, Clara? A transaction to be tallied and filed away?" "Yes," she lied. It was a desperate, transparent lie. Alexander stepped closer. He reached down and gripped the arms of her chair, leaning over her, trapping her in the heat of his body and the scent of sandalwood and smoke. "Look at me," he commanded. Clara looked up. He was inches away. She could see the dark ring around his pale irises. She could see the jagged, raised skin of the burned scar disappearing beneath his collar. "Society looks at me and they see a monster," he said, his voice a raw, jagged whisper. "They see a ruined, ugly thing. I bought you because I knew you wouldn't flinch. But I willn't take you to my bed as a chore. I will have you close your eyes and endure me for the sake of a contract." He was giving her an out. He was offering her the safety of her separate room, the safety of their cold, efficient partnership. He was terrified of her pity. Clara felt a sudden, fierce ache in the center of her chest. It was not fear. It was an overwhelming, crashing realization. He wasn't made of iron. Neither of them were. They were just two deeply bruised people who had spent their lives building armor. She lifted her hands from her lap. She didn't hesitate. She reached up and placed her palms flat against his chest. She felt the heavy, frantic thud of his heart beneath the fine wool of his waistcoat. Then she slid her right hand up his neck. Alexander flinched. It was a microscopic, instinctual recoil as her fingers traced the edge of the puckered skin. But Clara didn't pull away. She pressed her fingers gently, deliberately, against the most ruined part of him. "I have never flinched from you," Clara whispered, her voice fierce and completely stripped of cynicism. "And I'm not closing my eyes." Alexander let out a ragged breath, a sound that was half groan, half surrender. The rigid control he had maintained for 3 years shattered. He moved his hands from the chair to her waist, pulling her to her feet with a sudden, desperate strength. He didn't carry her to a bedroom. He didn't bother with the mechanics of a polite seduction. He backed her into the heavy oak bookshelves, his mouth crashing down on hers. There was nothing clinical about it. It was a collision. It was frantic, hungry, and entirely devoid of the cold efficiency they had promised each other. Clara met his intensity with her own, her hands tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself in the storm of him. He tasted of scotch and heat. His hands were rough as they mapped the curve of her spine, possessing her, claiming her not as property, but as a starving man claims a feast. He broke the kiss, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing harsh and ragged against her skin. "Clara," he rasped, her name sounding like a prayer in the dark room. She held him, feeling the solid, immovable weight of him pressing her against the books. The contract was dead. The ledgers were burned. In the freezing heart of winter, in the deepest shadows of Brambling, they stopped surviving and finally began to live. Spring broke over Yorkshire in a violent wave of green. The snow melted, turning the roads to thick mud, and the world outside Brambling woke up. Clara sat at the massive desk in her office, reviewing the planting schedules for the southern tenant farms. The nausea that had plagued her mornings for the past month had finally subsided, replaced by a quiet, profound certainty. She touched her stomach, a small, involuntary smile curving her lips. She had not told Alexander yet. She wanted to keep the secret to herself for just a few days more, a private piece of joy in a life that had previously held none. The heavy door to the office slammed open. Mrs. Gable stood there, breathing heavily, her usual iron composure entirely shattered. "Your Grace. In the main hall. You must come." Clara stood up instantly. "What is it?" "It's your father, Your Grace." The blood drained from Clara's face, leaving her completely cold. She walked past the housekeeper, her boots clipping sharply against the stone floors of the corridor. Lord George Stanton stood in the center of the magnificent entrance hall. He was a ghost of a man. His clothes, once fashionable, were frayed and stained. He smelled of cheap gin and desperation. The £10,000 had lasted exactly 6 months. The gambling dens of London had swallowed it whole, and they had spit him back out. He looked around the cavernous hall, his eyes wide with frantic greed. When Clara stepped onto the landing of the grand staircase, he looked up. A sickening smile stretched across his face. "Clara, my darling girl," he cried out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He took a step toward the stairs, but two massive footmen immediately stepped into his path, blocking him. "Tell these brutes to step aside. Your father has come to visit." Clara stood at the top of the stairs. She looked down at the man who had sold her for a laugh. She felt no anger. She felt no fear. She felt nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. "You do not have a daughter, Lord Stanton," Clara said. Her voice carried the absolute authority of the house she commanded. "Now, Clara, let us not be hasty," Stanton pleaded, his smile faltering, replaced by a whining desperation. "Things have been difficult. Lady Caroline left me. The creditors took the house. I have nothing. Surely the Duke can spare a few thousand to see your poor father through." "It's a pittance to him. Not a single penny," Clara said. Stanton's face hardened. The pathetic father vanished, and the vicious cornered rat emerged. "Don't play the Grand Duchess with me, girl. I know what you are. You were sold on a footstool like a prize pig. What do you think the papers in London will say when I tell them? The Duke of Hawkesbury's bought bride. It will be the scandal of the decade. He will be ruined. You will be a laughing stock." He took a step forward, glaring up at her. "Give me £5,000, Clara, today, or I go straight to the printing presses." He was playing his only card. He thought he could leverage her shame. He thought she was still the terrified girl staring at the crack in the plaster moulding at Montague Hall. Clara slowly descended the stairs. She didn't stop until she was standing 2 feet away from him, separated only by the footman. "Go to the papers," Clara said softly. Stanton blinked. "What?" "Go to the papers," she repeated, her voice dripping with ice. "Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them you auctioned your own flesh and blood to cover your gambling debts. Tell them a man of honor had to buy me to save me from your degeneracy. Who do you think society will despise more, George? The Duke who rescued a woman, or the father who sold her?" Stanton opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His threat was useless. She was completely immune. "Furthermore," Clara continued, stepping closer, leaning in so only he could hear, "I manage the accounts here. I control the funds. Alexander does not sign a single draft without my approval. Even if he wanted to pay you, I would burn the money first. You are dead to me. If you ever set foot on my property again, I will have the gamekeepers hunt you for sport." Stanton physically recoiled from her. He looked at her eyes and saw only his own ruin reflected back at him. "She speaks for the estate." The voice boomed from the gallery above. Alexander stood at the railing, looking down at the scene. He did not look angry. He looked like an executioner who had just been given a warrant. He walked slowly down the stairs. He bypassed Clara entirely and walked directly up to Lord Stanton. He grabbed the man by the lapels of his filthy coat and lifted him an inch off the floor. "I bought her from you," Alexander whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, contained violence. "That means you no longer exist in her world. If I ever see your face, if I ever hear your name, if I ever receive a letter from you, I will not call the magistrate. I will find you, George, and I will bury you in a hole so deep the devil himself won't hear you scream. Do you understand our contract?" Stanton nodded frantically, his eyes bulging, choking on his own collar. Alexander dropped him. "Throw this garbage off my land," he ordered the footman. The servants grabbed Stanton by the arms and dragged him backward out the heavy oak doors. He didn't struggle. He was a broken man. The doors slammed shut, echoing with finality. The great hall was silent. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs, her hands shaking slightly, the adrenaline suddenly receding, leaving her dizzy. Alexander turned to her. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her with crushing force, burying his face in her hair. Clara closed her eyes, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist, absorbing the heat and strength of him. He was her shield, and she was his. "He will never come back," Alexander murmured against her temple. "I know," Clara breathed. She pulled back slightly, looking up into his pale, fierce eyes. The ice in them was gone, replaced by a devotion so absolute it stole her breath. She took his hand and placed it flat against her stomach. "He is the past, Alexander. We only care about the future now." Alexander froze. He looked down at her hand, pressing his palm against her dress, and then back up to her face. For the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Hawkesbury looked completely, profoundly terrified. And then, slowly, a smile broke across his scarred face. It was not a twitch. It was a real, blinding smile. He didn't say a word. He leaned down and kissed her, a promise sealed not in ledgers or ink, but in blood, bone, and an unbreakable love. Did Clara's ruthless revenge and Hawkesbury's absolute devotion leave you breathless? This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war won by a woman made of iron, and a duke who knew her true worth. If you loved watching Clara build her empire from the ashes of a cruel joke, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely independent heroine, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another epic romance. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite Clara moment? See you next time.